On Point is a production of WBUR Boston and is distributed by APM, American Public Media.
Support for On Point comes from BetterHelp, committed to supporting mental health through therapy. Clients are matched with one of 30,000 therapists and can communicate via video, chat, or phone at betterhelp.com/public. And the Mehrotra Institute for Business, Markets, and Society, hosting the Is Business Broken podcast, featuring conversations with academics, industry leaders, and politicians. More at ibms.bu.edu.
This is KUOW-FM Seattle, KUOW Tumwater, and KQOW Bellingham. It's close to noon and about time for Week in Review. Filling in for Bill Radke, Brian Callanan is here to give us a taste of what's ahead.
We've got a lot ahead here. Coming up on the show, Mayor Bruce Harrell delivered his State of the City speech this week. He says there's a lot to celebrate in Seattle, but at one point, some people thought he shot an air ball. Also, thousands of people came to Seattle to protest President Trump, while at the same time, some big local businesses have removed mentions of diversity from their websites. All this plus, we'll be sure to give you something to smile about. That's all coming up on Week in Review, right after the news.
The Trump administration's rhetoric on expansion has been pretty unpopular among Greenlandic citizens.
We will never surrender to anyone.
But there are some outliers.
From the first term, I was supporting him here in Greenland.
I'm Juana Summers in Greenland's capital with diverging views on Trump's ambitions here on All Things Considered from NPR News.
All Things Considered coming up this afternoon at 3 on KUOW.
Support for KUOW comes from Blessed Sacrament Seattle, presenting Thou Art Rock, music for St. Peter with the Cantorai Parish Brass and Organ. Friday, February 28th at 7:30 p.m. Details and tickets at blessed-sacrament.org/rock.
Are you light on time but heavy on curiosity about what's going on in Seattle? Then subscribe to Seattle Now, KUOW's signature news podcast. Every morning, we go deep on a story you need to know about in less than 15 minutes. Check out Seattle Now on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts. And let's get caught up together.
What do spiders and astronauts have in common?
Do astronauts eat flies too?
No. They both love to float through space. On the latest Spectacular Specimens,
KUOW's podcast for kids and adults,
the millions of spiders in the air right now.
Listen to Spectacular Specimens with your favorite kids on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Rain is on the way this afternoon, lasting through the weekend. Highs through the weekend will be in the upper 50s, lows in the upper 40s. It's currently 48 at KUOW. It's 12:01.
Live from NPR News, I'm Lakshmi Singh. House Republicans are scheduled to vote on their budget resolution next week. NPR's Deirdre Walsh reports on how Medicaid is becoming a central flashpoint in the debate.
The House GOP budget resolution calls for up to $2 trillion in spending cuts to pay for extending Trump's tax breaks. A significant chunk of the cuts are expected to come from Medicaid, the federal health program for the poor, elderly, and disabled. House Speaker Mike Johnson insists there is waste, fraud, and abuse in the program. But some GOP lawmakers who represent districts with large numbers of Medicaid recipients warn they could oppose any proposal that endangers their constituents' benefits. House Republican leaders can only afford to lose one vote to advance their budget. The Senate has approved a different budget resolution Friday, and both chambers still need to agree on one plan to advance the president's top border and tax priorities. Deirdre Walsh, NPR News, Washington.
Hamas says it's investigating after Israeli authorities said the militant group failed to ensure that the body of an Israeli woman would accompany the remains of her two young sons as agreed. 4 bodies were turned over, but Israel says Shiri Bibas was not one of them. The incident caused outrage in Israel and threats of retaliation from the prime minister. NPR's Hadil al-Shalchi says tomorrow is another big day. That's when Hamas is due to turn over 6 more hostages who are alive.
NPR talked to an Israeli official who's familiar with the matter, but they weren't authorized to speak publicly. And we were told that Israel is actually inclined to move ahead with Saturday's prisoner exchange. They said Israel just doesn't want to jeopardize the release of the Israeli hostages this weekend. But then the official also said Israel is going to take advantage that Shiri Bibas's body wasn't returned as a point of negotiation to ask for more hostage releases.
NPR's Hadil Al-Shalchi. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's praising his meeting this week with the Trump administration's special envoy for Ukraine and Russia. He says there's hope. Here's NPR's Joanna Kakissis.
In a video address, Zelensky praised the Trump envoy, Keith Kellogg, and said Ukraine needs strong agreements with the U.S. We discussed the need for a reliable system of security guarantees so the war does not return and the Russians do not destroy more lives, Zelensky said. We all need peace. Ukraine, Europe, America, the whole world. Zelensky said he and Kellogg also talked about a deal that would give the U.S. control over some of Ukraine's mineral rights in exchange for continued military aid. Earlier this week, Trump repeated Kremlin talking points attacking Ukraine and Zelensky lamented that Trump was living in, quote, a space of disinformation. Joanna Kakissis, NPR News, Kyiv.
In Los Angeles, Mayor Karen Bass has dismissed Fire Chief Kristen Crowley, alleging serious performance problems before and after the devastating Palisades and Eaton fires in January. This is NPR News.
This is KUOW News. I'm Kevin Kniestead in Seattle. U.S. Senator Maria Cantwell continues to raise concerns about the so-called Department of Government Efficiency's decision to fire hundreds of Federal Aviation Administration employees. At least 400 people have been let go from the FAA. And Cantwell says on the Senate floor yesterday she's perplexed by these cuts, especially given recent incidents like last month's midair collision between an Army helicopter and a commercial plane in Washington, D.C. But she did suggest DOGE is cutting the jobs to give the ultra-wealthy and corporations a tax break.
But I don't understand how making the skies less safe helps you in that agenda. It doesn't. The individual lives and safety of the American people are worth way more.
The senator also said the FAA does not have a surplus of technicians or engineers, and she says she's worried it will take years to rebuild the FAA. The Vancouver-Washington Public School Board voted this week to reaffirm its policy that limits immigration enforcement on school campuses. Oregon Public Broadcasting's Eric Neumann reports.
The vote during a special meeting Tuesday night doesn't change the district's policy, but it's an attempt to reassure parents who are worried about new executive orders from President Trump to expand immigration enforcement. Kyle Sproul is a Vancouver Public Schools board member.
It can be an unsettling time, and I want to make sure that our students can access their education without fear and anxiety.
Vancouver's policy is based on regulations drafted by the Washington State Attorney General's office. It says that anyone involved with immigration enforcement must provide administrators with a judicial warrant or court order before being allowed on school grounds. And it says staff will not be allowed to collect information about immigration or citizenship status of any person. I'm Eric Newman reporting.
This is KUOW.
Support for NPR comes from ARM, committed to delivering innovative, advanced computing designed to enable worldwide companies to unleash the capabilities and experiences of AI. The future of AI is built on ARM. ARM.com.
And welcome to your Friday. Welcome to Week in Review on KUOW. I'm Brian Callanan, in for the irreplaceable Bill Radke. We appreciate you listening. If you're watching on YouTube, amazing, and thank you. We have some ground to cover this week, from local companies changing their approach on diversity as a response to the Trump administration, to a move by the state legislature to change how many parking places are required for new buildings, and a State of the City address from Seattle Mayor Bruce Harrell that included a stand-up comedy act that didn't stand up at all for some basketball fans out there. To help us figure all this out, I have with me Lauryn Bray, a writer and reporter for the South Seattle Emerald. Lauryn, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Also here, David Kroman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. Hey, David.
Hello.
And finally, Bill Finkbeiner, real estate investor and former state representative and senator who, I should point out, when I was talking to him about local headlines earlier this week, sent a photo of a backyard plumbing project he was digging up. Bill, it's great to see you, and I got to say, you don't smell nearly as bad as I thought you would.
Hey, thanks. We got the shower going this morning.
That's
so
important.
That was good news.
That's important. That's important. Great to see everybody here. Let's get to it. Seattle's 57th mayor, Bruce Harrell, gave his State of the City address this week at Benaroya Hall with a speech titled, "A City on the Rise." As the mayor sees it, there is optimism in the city of Seattle that we're on the right track, but there's also an awareness that there's a lot more work to do.
New ambitions, new breakthroughs, new innovations. We learn how to reinvent ourselves again and again with the same soul, but with a renewed spirit.
The mayor touted a number of achievements, the transformation of the waterfront, increased police hiring, and more. Side note, he is running for re-election. And the mayor also struck a serious note of caution when he was talking about the Trump administration threatening to pull funding from the city of Seattle due to its so-called sanctuary city status. David, talk to us about this. Is the mayor's statement that Seattle is on the rise well-founded? How do you assess it?
Yeah, I mean, I think what he's talking about probably mostly is around public safety, because that's what a lot of people in City Hall right now were elected on, was turning around public safety. And so if that is your barometer, then yeah, I mean, and if your goal was to hire more police officers, as his was, and as a lot of the members of the city council was, then yes, I mean there are a lot more applications coming into the Seattle Police Department, largely because they are now the best paid in the state. They are hiring. They hired one more officer than they lost last year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but compared to the years when they were losing many more than that, it is a shift. Fentanyl overdoses do seem to be have at least plateaued and maybe have gone down a little bit. There has been a pretty concerted effort, particularly around 3rd Avenue downtown, to have a more constant police presence. So I mean I think in a lot of those sort of barometers, yes, there has been a shift. But as far as what people are feeling day to day, this question of sort of long-term sustainability of a lot of these efforts, putting a lot of police officers in quote hotspot areas is a tried and true technique that does genuinely make a difference in the short term,
and can push things to other hotspots.
Push things to other hotspots. So I think he was doing basically what you would expect him to do in an election year state of the city, which is at once sort of try and celebrate how great he's done and how great his administration has done, while also not sounding totally out of touch with the people who might be still feeling kind of frustrated.
Fair. Lauryn, what'd you make of the speech?
I would agree with that. And yeah, I would say as a whole, my whole thoughts on the speech, I would agree with that. But specifically talking about the comment where he says that Seattle is a city on the rise, I always think that on the rise is like coded like term for a city that's being gentrified or has been gentrified or will continue to be gentrified. So to speak to that particular part of it, I think that, yeah, Seattle is a city that is quote unquote on the rise. At the same time, though, your specific comment when you were saying that this is typical of a speech that we would hear from someone that is seeking re-election, I would say so. I would say that he focused mostly on like the positives, on the progress that has been reached. And yeah, so I would say that there are some things that he could have mentioned potentially.
Okay. Such as, any thoughts?
I don't, and I just want to say I did watch it once.
Okay.
And as a journalist, I typically like to watch things more than once. So, but I did watch it once, and I don't remember him saying too much about the fact that we are facing a budget deficit and any sort of like, this is what I plan to do about that, right. So that was a little bit like, I think we're focusing a little bit on, the cup being half full. But yeah, I don't know. I think that there's a lot of important things that he did highlight, a lot of issues that I think that have been steadily improving, but maybe might not have as much progress as he thinks.
Right. The police hiring is a great example of that. Bill, did you have any thoughts on the speech, what the mayor said?
I mean, I think, David and Lauryn pretty much summed it up. It sounds like kind of a re-election speech, right? Like he's going to talk about all the great things that are happening. And
yeah, you've made a couple of those speeches in your day.
You tend not to bring up the bad news unless somebody asks you the question.
Right.
So, yeah, I think that was, I think that's part, and I think he's got some things that he can be proud of, that the things that he ran on, I think he has made some improvements that he can point to specifically. And if not, that things are getting better, at least in those areas, maybe that they, stop getting worse, fentanyl overdoses being one of them.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think he's got a strong case to make, and sounds like he made it.
David, I wanted to jump back to you for what I thought was kind of an eyebrow-raising headline this week. You and KUOW reported that he was arrested. The mayor was arrested in September of 1996 in Iowa for 3 misdemeanors: carrying a concealed gun, displaying that weapon in the presence of another person, and resisting arrest. He said he was a victim of racial profiling. Bruce Harrell did. These charges were later dropped. What's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting anecdote, I would say. I mean, that's how I would frame this, is that it's an anecdote in his biography that we hadn't known about before. That's not to say, I mean, I think there was the legitimate question of, why we're writing about this now and what the significance of it is, considering how old it is and the fact that it's been dismissed. I think those are perfectly valid and fair points. For me, it was interesting and stood out because because Bruce Harrell has been in political office for almost 20 years in Seattle right now. And over that time, we've come to sort of, there's this, arc of his biography and how Bruce Harrell got to be the person he is today. He's a football player, worked for U.S. West, big cellular company, started his own law firm, then went on to Seattle City Council, and then eventually mayor. Missing from that arc was these couple of years that he spent in Omaha, Nebraska. That had never come up before, and he'd worked for this pretty high-profile law firm down there. And so that was always a gap. That was a gap in his resume that hadn't been provided before. And so I think it's fairly clear that it was because he had this run-in with the police, which again was dismissed, that he describes as being pretty traumatic for him, and says that he was a victim of racial profiling in it. Which I don't have any reason to disbelieve that. But when we are talking about the mayor of Seattle, for my sort of news judgment on this, I think it's important that we have a full understanding of how he got to be the person he is today, how he got here, and the fact that for so many years there was this kind of gap, as it turns out. And I mean, if you had looked on his LinkedIn profile, he said he had worked at the cellular company in the years when he was actually in Omaha. So there was some I don't know, fudging of his resume here. And again, I don't want to overstate the significance of this. I think as far as things that Bruce Harrell has had to deal with this week, I think his joke about the Sonics was probably,
which we're getting to that,
which was probably a harder thing for him to deal with than this. Yeah. And that's fair. So I don't want to overstate it, but it is, again, he's up for re-election. We're retelling the story of who Bruce Harrell is. And this was a period of his life that had never been told before. And so, while I can understand why some people might question why we're bringing it up now, I still think it's important to kind of get the full picture of who he is.
Lauryn, did you have a thought about this?
I agree. I think it's a very interesting part of his lore that we didn't have before. And I think that's why a lot of people are, interested by it. I think the part about him saying that he was a victim of racial profiling, that could be true. I'm an abolitionist. I don't necessarily agree or believe in the carceral system that we have today. I don't always necessarily trust, what is documented by police on paper. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what happened, at the end of the day. I don't know what happened in that parking lot. I don't even know if he was in the parking lot. Do they have CCTV footage? I could play devil's advocate all day. But if we were to assume that this is something that happened, and as you mentioned with the fudging of the resume, it does seem like something that he wanted to bury or did not want people to know about. And I'm, as a journalist, very interested in why that is.
Bill, did you have any thoughts on this? An interesting side story here.
Yeah. I mean, I think I think that, first of all, I think that the only person that we've heard from who was there was the mayor. And his story feels to me credible. Like what he says makes sense. Yeah. It feels to me that in 1998 in Omaha, Nebraska, was that where it was? It's, that it very well could have been a victim of profiling.
96, yeah, keep going.
96, and that he felt under threat to some degree. I mean, apparently he was potentially being, running for an office or being nominated for an office.
Yeah.
So I think that, that it's an anecdote. I can understand why he wouldn't want to necessarily have it come out, and I think that's kind of too bad because I don't think there's anything there, and especially because it was also thrown out. I mean,
right,
that's
right. Most important.
This isn't, and so to me, I don't know. It's borderline to me about. I mean, I understand why people would run it, and I get that.
Yeah.
But it's kind of something happened a long time ago, and it's like there's a clear explanation for it, and it was thrown out, like, and maybe I'm just having empathy for him, maybe that he didn't want it.
And that's all right, too. Empathy's an okay thing. But I did want to do a final touch on the mayor because there was this moment in the speech, and David alluded to this earlier, where he gave the crowd a little bit of a head fake, I should say. Picture this, listeners. The mayor said these words while holding up a basketball.
I have an announcement to make. I'm just kidding. I got
Now, many people thought he was referring to pro basketball returning to Seattle, the Sonics, a team that was relocated to Oklahoma City in 2008. And while I did hear some laughter in the crowd, it was definitely a great gotcha moment there. Some fans online were not as kind. The mayor actually later apologized for the joke. Bill, I just wanted to ask you on this one. You've given a few speeches in your day as a state leader. How did you approach humor when you gave a speech? Did you say to your staff, I've got the funniest joke in the world? And they said, no, Bill, don't do that.
How did I approach it?
Yes.
Poorly.
Now, that's a good punchline. Okay.
My timing was not nearly as good as the mayor's. I read about it, and I was like, oh, that's kind of funny. And then I listened to it, and it was like, oh, it was actually pretty good timing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, boy, I'd rather have, a mayor with a sense of humor. It's like, give it a try and lighten up, people. And I think that could be, that what you just said, could be sort of the story of our age. Some people online didn't like it.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Shocker.
That's a very, very good point. Did you have something, David?
Oh, I thought it was funny. I thought it was a good bit. I was in the room at the time. I've been through. I've sat through almost 10 of these State of the Cities. They're always pretty boring.
States of the City.
States of the City.
Yes.
Yeah, right. People laugh when they're supposed to laugh or applaud when they're supposed to applaud. This was the first time I'd ever seen a genuine emotional reaction to a bit from the mayor, and it was
They didn't
funny.
know what to do, right?
I've never seen a mayor booed at his own State of the City before. I think it was an affectionate boo, but the fact that he had to apologize, I don't know. I mean, it was a funny joke. We're talking basketball here. We're not talking, anything more serious.
Yeah, fair. I did want to move on to another issue here with regard to President's Day, which brought a rally of thousands to downtown Seattle this Monday to protest our current president. And we have a lot to talk about here. These are people who are protesting here. They aren't the only ones with some deep concerns about the Trump administration. KUOW reports this week that some local federal workers are describing the second Trump term as a terror campaign. They don't know if they're getting fired or not. They're scared their coworkers might snitch on them if they talk about politics that don't align with President Trump's. Lauryn, I wanted to ask you about this because the South Seattle Emerald reported 10,000 federal workers were laid off just this past weekend. Are workers pushing back? What's going on here?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of protests in person myself, so I can speak firsthand that I've seen people very upset about this. 10,000, I think that's the figure, as you said, over the last weekend, but I think people are quoting as much as 75 or 77,000. So I just want to point to that number
there's more.
as well.
There's more, right.
But yeah, it's definitely incited protests around the country, not even just within our city, but I saw a photo of people, and I think it was Washington Square Park in New York City. People were protesting there. So yeah, it is something that a lot of people are very upset about. And speaking to what you had mentioned about it creating like a terror campaign or a culture of snitching, I know there was an article KUOW had published that had mentioned that it created kind of a culture of snitching in a lot of federal workplaces.
Yeah.
And that is quite unfortunate, because if this is really about an overhaul of government efficiency and trying to figure out, what layers of bureaucracy can we peel back to kind of get things moving, get the ball rolling, save money, right?
Yeah.
That is a hindrance in itself to all of that. So you're creating chaos to kind of move forward, but the chaos in itself is a huge step back. So I'm very interested to see how this is going to progress. I don't think it's going to get better for quite some time.
Yeah.
I think the uncertainty of it, though, is promising. I always, in moments like this, whenever people want to, or there's a kind of maybe a propensity to be upset or to feel hopeless or down. I think that in moments of uncertainty, we can look to, okay, what new thing can we create from what has been destroyed? So that is what I'm focused on. I'm very interested to see what is made of all of this chaos.
There's a lot going on. There are 5 federal unions for workers that have sued the Trump administration over these different firings. So there's a lot in play right here. And I also wanted to take note that this week, businesses like Starbucks, Amazon, the K&L Gates law firm have either removed or watered down any mentions of diversity on their websites. President Trump signed an executive order soon after he took office, banning federal agencies and contractors from promoting diversity, and asked the U.S. Attorney General's office to identify, quote, the most egregious and discriminatory DEI practitioners, end quote, for possible federal investigations. There's a lawsuit against this order. The NAACP last week published a buying guide asking Black Americans to push their buying power towards companies that have not pulled back their DEI programs. But I just wanted to throw it out there. Has this struggle for diversity, equity, and inclusion turned into an economic battle? Can you put a price tag on those values? What's happening here?
Well, I just want to say something that I think is really important, and this is just part of what has been happening with Trump's administration. DEI, I feel like, has been misunderstood to be something other than what it is. DEI is an acronym that means diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that for a lot of the people that are essentially attacking it and trying to get rid of it, they believe that it is some sort of advantage that non-white people are getting in the workplace over white people.
Some zero-sum thinking here, yeah.
Right, and it's other, intersections with that as well. Not just race, but right. It's just concern of like people getting unfair advantage because they are part of the margins of society, right? And I just want to say that is not at all what it is. So the idea that we are kind of creating all of this chaos, creating all of this hoopla over something that we are misunderstanding to be an issue that is not the actual issue is also something that I feel like is very unfortunate.
What would you describe DEI as? What does it mean?
Well, diversity, equity, inclusion. You can look at the definitions of each of those things. And so when I understand diversity, diversity is having different things, different people of different walks, different backgrounds, different identities, right? Diversity. Everybody is different, or most people within the group are different.
Mm-hmm.
Equity is the idea that people start from different points. If you think about like a race, everybody is starting farther at a different, not at the same point in the starting line.
Right, not the same starting line.
Right, not the same starting line, but the finishing line is the same. So it's like everybody is trying to get to this final point, but we're all starting at different points.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is that because people are starting have a different starting line, that there's different needs that need to be provided for those people so that they can have the same starting line as everyone else.
Right.
And so that is the idea of equity. Inclusion is the idea that we need to include different people, or that we need to have lower barriers so that people can access things.
Yeah.
And so, none of those things explicitly state we're going to give unfair advantage to any specific person.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to get back to this whole idea of putting a price tag on this. When you see these different companies either watering down or removing mentions of DEI on their websites, what does that say to you?
Yeah, I think my colleagues Jim Brunner and Alex Halverson wrote about the 3 companies that you'd mentioned, and they had this really enlightening quote in there from, I can't remember who gave it, but it was basically, these companies are seeing this as, I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun the person next to me. And I do think that's a lot of what's happening here is, and why there's a certain level of proactivity from private companies, because public entities that are getting a lot of money from the federal government, you might disagree with the decision, but there is probably more of a basis for them to remove some of their DEI programs. Fred Hutch, for example, rolled back some of their programming because they get just an absolute enormous amount of federal money that would, put their operations belly up. And so, they made the calculation. Again, you could disagree with this calculation, but they made the calculation that their day-to-day work is more important than these programming. Mm-hmm. But when you look at Starbucks or Amazon or this law firm K&L Gates, that's where the things get a little, I don't know, more interesting or squishy because a lot of them, they have federal contracts, but the bulk of their business is not dependent on the federal government. But I think this level of proactivity that they're taking is they're just trying to, outrun the person next to them when the bear comes coming down. So, Costco, for example, has said, we're not getting rid of our programming. The Trump administration, I would say, is probably more likely to go after Costco for some reason than they are Amazon or Starbucks if Amazon or Starbucks do these couple things. So, it's that level of companies and entities doing stuff before they have been made to do it to just kind of stay ahead of the game a little bit stands out to me.
I wanted to take one more take on this because this week, Washington State's Superintendent of Schools, Chris Rakedahl, is telling school districts not to change their DEI programs, despite a recent order from the Trump administration to eliminate race-based decision-making from schools by the end of February, that's next week, or possibly lose their federal funding. Rakedahl says the letter he received from the Federal Department of Education does not hold the power of law. Is he gambling with the lives of the million-plus kids in Washington State's K-12 system, or how do you look at this, Bill?
There's a lot of instances where the federal government makes their money contingent on, things. I remember one of them that always surprised me was the back when there was the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. That was a thing from the federal government. You couldn't get federal dollars for your roads unless you had a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. And in education, that's probably mostly the case. Like there's a lot of, most of the federal money comes with strings attached. And I want to kind of make the, reinforce what I heard David say, which I totally agree with. Like, it's like, okay, regardless what you think of DEI, that's the federal government has a position where they can say, here's money that we're handing out, and there's strings attached to it. To me, when you say what's the cost of private companies, scrubbing their websites of this, feeling like they're going to be attacked by the federal government if they don't do this, that to me is like the cost is free speech, right? I mean, that is really obviously very disconcerting. And for Reichdahl, I saw his announcement. I feel like that would be better. I feel like we've got a good AG in this state who is very aware that he's got a position where he can challenge the constitutionality of federal issues. I feel like that he's going to do a good job of that. I feel like where I hope our state really looks at is in the next few years and the next few months. There's going to be, I feel like the Trump administration is going after things where they feel like they have public opinion on their side so far. And they're going to get into some really much more difficult issues. And hopefully we can build the coalitions, I think across party lines and across everybody to, these things like the freedom of speech and a lot of the other issues that are going to be coming up here soon.
Yeah. Any other thoughts about our schools? This is a big issue for a lot of families in our region, in our state. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, when you talk about these things, I mean, to Lauren's point, it is important to focus on the actual definitions of what's happening and the public schools, Washington Public Schools DEI policies. That doesn't mean that there are race-based decisions happening. I'm not a schools reporter, so I couldn't say for certain one way or the other, but saying that DEI equals race-based decision-making isn't necessarily true.
And like speaking to that, if the idea, or from what I'm also like not an alt-right person at all, so I don't know what the logic is, but the idea and what I've been hearing is the fear is that DEI gives unfair advantage in certain contexts, right, when applied. So if we're talking about a public school, like what unfair advantage are these DEI programs giving to students? Like are they, I can't.
What evidence are you pointing to? Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Like
what are you trying to fix?
What's the issue in saying that little Timmy can, be black? Like, I don't know. I don't get it. But yeah.
Right. Well, a lot still ahead here. And coming up, more on immigration concerns, a story with connections to a local airfield all the way to Guantanamo Bay and beyond. You're listening to Week in Review.
Support for KUOW comes from Enterprise Washington with Budget Breakdown, a nonpartisan resource on the Washington state budget. Washington will collect $10 billion more in tax revenue over the next 4 years, with spending set to outpace that revenue. Learn more about state taxes and spending at budgetbreakdown.org. And from Live Nation, presenting Dave Matthews Band at the Gorge Amphitheater over Labor Day weekend, August 29th, 30th, and 31st. Tickets available at livenation.com.
For decades, NPR listeners across the country have tuned in at the top of the hour to hear a live update on the latest local and national news. Now, you can catch all the local newscasts in a new place, your podcast feed. Listen to KUOW Newscast, updated every hour with new headlines. Find it in the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts.
And welcome back to Week in Review. Brian Callanan with you, and I'm joined by real estate investor and former state rep and state senator Bill Finkbeiner, David Kroman of the Seattle Times, and Lauryn Bray from the South Seattle Emerald. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching on YouTube, too. Immigration, another top issue this week, with the White House releasing video of chained deportees at Boeing Field. This is a practice that happened under the Biden administration, too, chains, the whole thing. It just wasn't publicized and celebrated, if that's the right word, on social media in the same way as the Trump administration did this week. So, are we seeing mass deportations in our state? KUOW's Gustavo Sagrero has been working to get on top of this story.
Seattle's ICE office has not responded to multiple requests asking about its immigration enforcement since Trump took office, but it has put out statements about a handful of arrests, and in about half, the only charge was being in the country illegally. It's unclear how many arrests and deportations have possibly increased in Washington, or how many of those arrests are of violent criminals, or if ICE is detaining people they just happen to come across. But what is clear is there's a lot of rumors.
That's what I'm hearing right now, and I just wanted to put it out there. Are we seeing mass deportations in our state, or is this just a spectacle? Bill?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in that. I think that the number, from what I understand, the number of deportations hasn't increased dramatically yet since, a year ago. But what we're seeing, I think, is two things. One, what's really bothersome to me is sort of a bullying for, I don't know, exactly, but basically this sort of like celebrating, like, we're going to put people in chains and take pictures. It's like, it's just dehumanizing. Yeah. It's just, and that's a scary thing when a government dehumanizes anyone, I think. That's disconcerting. So a lot of it is the way it's been going about. And then I feel like there really should be much clearer and better statistics, because there are a lot of very serious questions. And I think that we can assume that there's going to be more reasons to have concern in the coming months and years. So, yeah, I feel like getting clear information would sure be a big. And there's a lot of people that support immigration reform, and again, if that's what you support, great. But we should know what's happening with it, and we should understand, in which cases it's being applied and how, and that's hopefully something that happens.
Some other thoughts about this.
I would say I don't have the data to support that mass deportations are happening, but I would.
Well, apparently we don't have much data at all.
Yeah,
so.
I was about to say we wouldn't have it because the time turnaround. Yeah, but I will say I have heard anecdotes like in my personal life of people being deported. Like I was just on TikTok and I heard about this man who said that his mom was just randomly deported. Like she just paid her taxes and then like randomly they just rounded her up and deported her. So that's the first instance that I heard. And then I also work at a hospital. I'm not going to say what hospital because I'm not allowed to represent them. But there was a patient that is like now under ICE custody, and like now ICE has to be the one to bring him to all of his appointments as opposed to him walking to the office himself. And there was a local Venezuelan migrant that was sent to Guantanamo Bay.
Yes,
that's
Jose Medina Andrade living in Renton, apparently.
Mm-hmm. So that's 3 stories right there. 2 of them local. I'm not sure what state the man in the TikTok that I watched resides in, but yes, the fact that I've already come across 3 anecdotes of this happening tells me, oh yeah, we don't have the data about this, but like this is happening.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that Andrade story? Why should people be concerned about that? He's being held at Guantanamo Bay, is what he said in a press release that was released last weekend.
Yeah, so the one of the organizations that I know that was talking about it is let me see if I can pull it up. It's has Familia in the name. I'm blanking on it. I've covered them before, so I'm ashamed. But
we'll get you.
Yeah, they were talking about they had posted a kind of like a press release statement on their Instagram about it, but it was part of a group of dozens of people that were sent to Guantanamo Bay. What's also unfortunate is I don't know if they've identified everybody that has been sent. I can't definitively say that has happened. So I'm not sure that everybody that has been sent, like that their family is aware that they have gone. So we also, I don't think, have everybody's name. So yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty with it. Once again, because we don't have the data. Number two, because ICE is historically known for not interacting with the families of the people that they take, and they're not always keen on being transparent about like their operations at all. So yeah,
it's a big concern. And David, did you have some thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that video took place at Boeing Field, in part because there had been fights over Boeing Field that preceded the Trump administration. I think the bulk of, I mean, my timing's a little off. I think the bulk of them may have actually happened under the Biden administration. This question of whether or not Boeing Field, which is technically, I think its real name is King County Field.
Right.
I mean, it's a
That's
King
right.
County
Entity,
It's a King County
yeah.
entity,
Mm-hmm.
Meaning that the King County government has some authority over this, and so they had decided at some point that that field should not be used for deportations, and so those had shifted, I think, to Yakima, and then I think it was a court ruling that then said, you can't bar this from being used for this specific purpose, and so that's just sort of an interest that where this kind of culmination of that fight that King County ultimately lost, essentially, so that the Trump administration is using that King County field to do its deportations and celebrating that. But again, to the point of like what is actually happening, like I said, this fight was happening, I think, mostly under the Biden administration.
Yeah.
So these deportations were happening from Boeing Field before. It's just because the Trump administration ran so hard on this, they are, advertising what's happening. And so it's, I heard a story, I think it was on NPR, about how Mexico had set up all these tents on the other side of the border in anticipation of mass deportations, and they have not filled up at all. They haven't come. And so it is very, very hard to parse out what is actually happening. Are there actually mass deportations, or are we just hearing about it, and are people just more freaked out about it, so they're talking about it more?
I also was able to find an article. They did identify all 53 of the migrants that were taken to Guantanamo Bay, and I believe that they're all men and they're all Venezuelan citizens. So that's interesting as well. And the organization that had posted about it is Capybara Colectiva.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I appreciate that. I was seeing that. And also, you've got groups like the International Migrants Alliance working on this and many others. So I did want to talk about what elected leaders in our area are doing about this immigration situation. Our state AG, you brought this up earlier, Bill. He's been busy filing lawsuits. City and county leaders have spoken out. What can they actually do? Do you have a feel for that at all?
I mean, I think you can look at some of what Governor Ferguson did when he was AG in the first Trump term. I think that he, probably learned a lot, and our current AG was working with him closely, and so I think it's probably going to be even better. So I think what they can do is they can determine which. It's so hard because so many people right now are so frustrated by what they read and hear every day, and it feels so overwhelming. What I think our Attorney General is doing is parsing through that and saying which of these things are actionable, which of them are actually violating the Constitution or violating the laws of the United States.
And which of them are distractions?
And which of them are talk, or which of them are bad but still not against the law or against the Constitution, right? There's going to be things that they do that most people are going to disagree with that they can still legally do, but there's clearly things that they are doing that the courts are going to have concerns about. So, yeah, so I feel like I think our AG's already led on the
Birthright citizenship.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you. I
Well,
appreciate that.
if we look at the history of like Guantanamo Bay and like what they did before and the people that they sent there before, after like following 9/11, like most of the people, I can't even say if any of the people that they sent there were actually like terrorists. So like, I don't think that they know anything about these people that they've sent. I think it's literally just the fact of their immigration status being undocumented. I can't say that they have any definitive reason to believe that anyone is doing any wrongdoing in the community. And based off of the track record, I don't think they care.
This is an issue of due process that certainly raises some constitutional concerns. But I did want to bring it back locally because I saw this report in Cascade PBS this week that shows most of the county sheriffs in our state appear to be following the state law, the Keep Washington Working Act, that says officers are not supposed to ask about immigration status. They're not supposed to detain immigrants on behalf of ICE. That said, the sheriff of Klickitat County, Bob Songer, has said publicly he wants ICE to keep him on speed dial. I wanted to throw this out there, too. How are local law enforcement agencies dealing with immigration right now? Some thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, in theory, because of the Washington state law, they're not supposed to be helping.
If there's a criminal case, they do get involved.
Right,
That's
right.
important to
That's
point
true.
that out. Yeah.
And that also is a thing to point out too. You know, I think there's been some high profile cases of people being arrested, and then it turns out they have extensive criminal history, and that isn't actually that new. Like if somebody has been arrested and charged with crimes, that is not a new development that those people would probably be arrested and deported. That's been happening for a long time. That's not a new development in the Trump administration. But, I mean, I think, you look at a place like Seattle, of course, where it's pretty explicit that the Seattle Police Department is not supposed to be helping ICE. But there's this other question of like, even if they could, do they have the resources to do it? It seems unlikely.
Well, no, I think a lot of advocates would say, hey, stay in your lane.
Yeah.
Your job, our tax dollars are paying for this.
Right.
You, enforcing the laws of the city, not the federal government.
And, I think that is an argument. There's obviously the sort of, very out sort of anti-Trump policies, people who want these sort of sanctuary policies on the books to, as a answer to the Trump administration. But then there's the sort of more muted opposition to it. And I think that's what we hear from, say, the Seattle city attorney, who in 2020 ran for state office as a Republican.
That's right.
She has said that she voted for Joe Biden, I think, in the last election. So, the state of her political affiliation is a little ambiguous, but not somebody who has taken up the mantle of being, a member of the resistance or whatever you want to call it. But nevertheless, filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration, or at least joined a lawsuit around these, saying that the Trump administration shouldn't be able to cut funding for Seattle over its sanctuary policies. And when I talked to her about it, she first made that point that she would only file lawsuits about things that are actually happening. She wasn't going to be running after every sort of statement from Trump and go after every hypothetical. But, when you're sort of asking for the rationale, the thing she really wanted to focus on in our conversation was, we have scarce resources, law enforcement resources here, and we have bigger priorities. And so that is the sort of gentle pushback, I would say, on Trump administration policies, which are, hey, we just don't have the time or energy or money to help you on this. And so we don't want to be made to prioritize for what you want.
Yeah.
Essentially, we can't afford to have a stance on this.
Yeah,
Wow.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Well, amid all these swirling federal policy issues impacting us here locally, the state legislature is taking up something this session that's right in your backyard, parking places. Or maybe it's not. Maybe you're part of the 46% increase of people who don't have cars in Seattle compared to 2010. But the state Senate has just approved a major parking reform bill that would limit the ability of local counties and medium and large-sized cities to require off-street parking in new development. This is Senate Bill 5184, if you're keeping score at home, sponsored by Democratic Senator Jessica Bateman from the 22nd District in Olympia. So should the state have the ability to dictate what cities need in terms of parking? Bill, what do you got?
Number one, they do have that authority. So whether they should or not,
Okay.
with the legislature, sometimes it's what they can do, not what they should do. And I think this is a good one, not a bad one to work on for them. It costs about $60,000 a parking space for underground parking. And that number, rolls up into rents. The flip side is that people like parking. And it's when the cities are doing permitting, they generally, if it's free to them, it's like, hey, add this on as a requirement, an extra cost to development, and that ends up adding costs to our, adding cost to housing. I do think that I think first of all, I should say this is mostly a bigger city issue, so. That's for underground parking. You're not going to see that in rural areas and further out. I've watched Bellevue Planning Department over the last year because the thing I've been involved with really work thoughtfully. The planning department work thoughtfully on these issues. There's definitely a change, I think, in planners in recognizing that costs that go to development end up going into housing. And so I think this is probably something that's going to, in Bellevue, they've talked about reducing by, 70, 80% their parking requirements. So I think this is already happening. I'd really like to see the legislature focus on legal reform around condominiums.
Oh, okay.
And because we just don't have a lot of condominiums being built in this state because the legal costs are so high. So
interesting.
Yeah, more than planning stuff's fascinating.
Oh yeah. No, it is. I mean, I look at this because the Senate passed this with a 40-8 vote. So Democrats and Republicans are both voting for this.
Yeah.
David, help us put it in perspective. Why is this a big deal? Talking about parking at the state level.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost. I mean, so there was a big deal bill that passed last year, HB 110, which basically required that cities across the state allow quadplex, fourplexes, and up to sixplexes throughout their city. And that was kind of controversial. It was seen as a big change. But when you talk to some kind of urbanists, housing policy types, some of them see this parking reform bill as actually being a bigger deal because. Of what Bill was saying, it's $60,000 a parking spot. That's a lot, and if you're, it drives up the sort of total cost, but then it also eats up space. If you have to put parking in, that's fewer places that you can build apartments. And so I think it's I think the kind of argument, the free market argument for it, which I think is why you see bipartisan support for it, is that if a developer is building in a place where people are demanding parking and won't go and live in your place unless you have parking, they're probably going to build parking because they can know that there's a market for it. But if you look to Capitol Hill and you're a developer and you're building a new building and you know that, I don't know what the numbers are in Capitol Hill, but probably the highest in the state of people who do not have a car.
Fewer people have cars, for sure.
There's just not the market for it because, if you're looking to go rent an apartment on Capitol Hill or buy a condo on Capitol Hill and you don't have a car, you're probably still going to be paying for a parking spot. And so I think what this bill is trying to do is it's not saying that there will no longer be parking at any, in any new development, but that the parking that's there will be there because the developers know that there's going to be a demand for it. And so, the hope is that by making these sort of changes that you lower the cost of housing and you add more units per development. I think for a lot of cities, Olympia has really, really taken on a pretty aggressive posture towards trying to spur more housing supply, and largely because of Jessica Bateman. She has really been the kind of lead voice on a lot of this stuff, and
lead voice between 11-10 as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think she has found this vein where she can work with Democrats and Republicans on this. But for cities like Seattle, for example, where you have some voices that are more skeptical of kind of free market supply and demand housing, it's creating this kind of interesting friction between Olympia and Seattle and some of these cities around this stuff that I think has probably always been there to an extent, but has just kind of grown more pronounced in recent years.
Lauryn, we were talking about parking places around KUOW before the show here. Did you have some thoughts on this?
One thing that you said was really, for me, what it is like the demand for parking spots is different based off of different neighborhoods, right? And one of the things about it, for me, that I understand about Capitol Hill is potentially why the demand and why people don't have cars there is because the light rail station is right there and there's complete access to public transportation. So like all the buses run through there. Like it's very easy to get around from Capitol Hill. It's also like right in the middle of the city. So I'm wondering if there was accessibility to public transportation everywhere in the way that it is in Capitol Hill, how many people would opt out of having a car? And would we need these parking spots.
Yeah, if you build it, they will come. They'll build the parking places. You'll get cars. Build the transit. Hopefully, you get people riding transit. For
Right,
sure.
right. And then there's people that say like, oh, well, public transportation needs to be safer in order for that to happen. And then that can open up a whole other conversation. But fundamentally, the issue that we have, or one of the biggest issues in this city, is a lack of housing. And parking spots or less parking spots could mean more housing. So I think that one of the reasons why people are excited about this is because maybe it opens the gateway to that conversation.
Issue in our city, issue in the state too. Yeah.
I should say, though, that a lot of these changes probably would have made more of a difference like 10 years ago.
Oh, for sure.
When
right.
interest
For
rates were
sure.
really low
Yeah.
and Seattle had more cranes per capita than anywhere in the world, or maybe just more cranes, period, than anywhere in the world.
Right.
Now, if you look at permit applications to the city of Seattle, they've kind of fallen off a cliff. Interest rates being what they are, I mean, housing is going to continue to be built, but just the finances of it aren't what they were before. And so I think possibly this could have really been felt on the ground if it had passed in 2015. Whether it's going to sort of result in some massive uptick in new housing, feels a little less likely today, possibly.
We shall see. All right. Well, when we come back, some headlines from beyond the grave. Actually, just one headline, but it is still pretty spooky. Stick around. You're listening to Week in Review.
Did y'all read
Support for KUOW comes from Eco Design and Maintenance, family-owned and specializing in start-to-finish exterior design using materials and methods that help to reduce environmental impact. From landscapes to hardscaping, outdoor spaces designed to be functional and long-lasting. More at eco-seattle.com. And from Third Place Books, Thomas Konstam discusses his novel Supersonic, a book that follows multiple generations of Seattleites in an interconnected cast. Thursday, February 27th at 7 p.m. Details at thirdplacebooks.com.
And we're back. Some headlines this week on Week in Review. Heaven Sent Fried Chicken in Seattle is closing. Its last store on Lake City Way, run by Azell Stevens, will shut down February 28th. He's one of the original partners of Azell's Chicken. So is his chicken better than what you're currently getting at Azell's? A long-running foodie feud on this? You got a week left to make your decision. Also in the news, 4 bus stops in Seattle's Little Saigon neighborhood are reopening on March 3rd after being shut down for public safety reasons. Seems like some good news there. And I wanted to draw attention to this one. Also in the news this week, the Crown Hill Cemetery in North Seattle is up for sale but still can't find a buyer. Been on the market for almost a year. The part I love about this story is the court-appointed owner of this cemetery is saying, yeah, if you buy some land here, you'd probably be a good 10, 20 feet away from an actual grave. So go for it. Are you getting on that on that deal, Bill? What do you think?
Take the kids out in the backyard and throw a baseball around.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know.
Sounds like a blast.
Poltergeist. But also it said it's not selling, so maybe it's going to be a giant discount. I don't know. It's interesting.
They make movies about this. Poltergeist
Right.
comes to mind. I mean,
Yeah.
come on, let's figure this stuff out. That's
Yeah, but those movies were made when there was like enough housing for people.
Exactly.
People might think cemetery. I don't know. It's a pretty good price.
Yeah, right. Solid burn. I like it. Well, I did want to talk about a great tradition of Week in Review. What is making our guests smile out there? What do we got, folks?
I just covered a story that made me smile. It was a nonprofit organization is hosting a fashion show for foster youth, and it's called Foster in Fashion, and it'll be on February 23rd from 6 to 9:30, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really cool going there and meeting the kids and they're not kids, they're really like teenagers.
Yeah.
But it was really cool going there and speaking with them and talking about like how important like fashion is specifically for people that grew up in foster care, because it's kind of like it's a stage in the sense that you're able to define your individuality in your own terms, because from what I was hearing, the experience of being like a foster youth is very much being defined by the world's terms.
Right. Bill, what do you have in your mind?
I'm excited about the Mariners. I know that's not always the most popular opinion, but I think they've got a good team. I think, there's reasons to feel hopeful.
Yes.
And they were good last year. I know everybody wishes they maybe did more in the offseason, but I think they're bringing back a strong pitching. I think we get a couple folks stepping up this year, and I think we could be right there. It'll be exciting.
Love it. Bolstering the KUOW sports department right here.
Training.
Any thoughts on your mind, David?
Well, as a buffer against egg prices, I recently got some chickens.
Nice.
And they're beautiful, good-looking chickens. And I wasn't expecting eggs, but one of them has started laying already, despite it being cold and dark out. And so, already I'm paying down all the prices, all the egg dollars I've been spending.
I love it. I wanted to point out that February 22nd tomorrow is World Sword Swallowers Day. We always exchange gifts on Sword Swallowers Eve, so I've got a huge weekend ahead for me. And I did want to thank everybody for joining us here. Lauren Bray from the South Seattle Emerald, David Kroman from the Seattle Times, Bill Finkbeiner, real estate investor and former state rep and senator. Thank you for being here.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
And a big thanks to producer Kevin Kniested. Kathy Faulkner's on the board. Social media from Juan Pablo Chiquiza. Additional support from Hans Twite. I'm Brian Callanan. If you're out this weekend enjoying spring training or purchasing a cemetery, hope you're getting some rest, or maybe you're resting in peace. Who knows? Have a good weekend.
Oh, nice.
Hi, I'm Chris Morgan, host of The Wild. Obsessions with nature can run deep. On the next episode of The Wild, a filmmaker who spent months in a free